Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial to my painting, Fillerup. The photograph on the right was a reference for this painting. It's an old gas station that I passed while driving through the countryside. The colors used in this painting are manganese blue, cerulean blue, royal blue, quinacridone burnt orange, raw sienna, rose madder quinacridone, and sap green. And I'm going to begin my painting with a sky wash. I'm just using cerulean blue. The building itself has some blue stripes on it, and I'm going to paint those with manganese blue, which is more of a blue-green. So even though the two colors are very close, there's a slight difference in them. So I'm using the cerulean blue in the sky, and I'll be using the manganese blue on the building to paint the blue stripe. And I'm going to bring this wash down on the side of this building, and as I get farther down, I'm going to start to introduce some water and thin that out a little bit, let that gradate out, and I'm going to come back in with some earthy tones because there's some trees that are right on the edge or running behind this building. So I'm going to do some wet and wet painting to introduce those tree shapes. So I've got some quinacridone burnt orange and some sap green, a little bit of royal blue, and I'm just going to softly put in some tone off the edge of this building and running all the way to the side of the paper. Now don't forget that the your composition needs to go all around the entire page and include the sides. Sometimes people will do a painting and it's floating in the middle of the page because they don't want to take it to the edge. So make sure you include the edge as part of your composition when you're doing a painting. So here you can see I've got some sap green with a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange mixed into it, and I'm just putting some touches of it wet and wet just to suggest that there's some trees back there. I'm going to take a little bit of a cooler mixture too and drop in there, so I've added a little bit more royal blue to the mixture, and I'm just hinting that there's some trees here or tree line, and I'm not really going to get very detailed in this, and it's not going to be very hard edge. I'm just going to leave it like that, but I am going to scrape into that with a plastic scraping tool to suggest some trees, some tree trunks and some branches. Not a lot, just enough to make the viewer understand that this is a little bit of a wooded area back there. It has some trees, has some soft shaped leaves, and we're not going to do much more back there. In my photograph, the sun is shining bright on the front and actually the side a little bit, but I want to have a little bit more dimension to my painting, and I'm going to take this blue wash, it has a little bit of royal blue in it, and I'm going to make this more of a shadowed side to this building. So I'm just using a 1/2 inch flat brush, and I'm just glazing over the right side of that building to put a little bit in shadow and contrast what's going on in the front of the building. I'm going to take that down to the ground, and then I'm going to take some more of this tone, and I'm going to paint the shadowed side of this awning. There's an awning where the pumps used to be, and it's still standing, and I'm going to put the same type of shadow on this side that's on the same plane as the side of the gas station. Now I'm also going to put some of this on the area here on the front of the building where this awning is casting a shadow. So I'm putting down light washes that start to define where the light, middle value, dark value is going to be, and where the bright whites are going to be, the pure white of the paper, or very light tones. Now I'm going to take a light valued mixture that has a little bit of raw sienna, a little cerulean blue, a little rose madder quinacridone, and I'm going to start to paint the rooftop of this gas station. So it's still a very light value, and I'm just working with a 1/2 inch flat brush. Just continuing to bring out wash across. I'm not going to get real detailed with the rooftop. I'm just going to put a wash on it. I'll put a little bit of texture in it and maybe some kind of calligraphic marks on it, but I'm not going to try and do a detailed rendering of the rooftop. I'm going to take my scraping tool while it's still damp. It's almost past the point where you can really move the paint. It's all starting to dry, but there's still enough moisture here where I can push some of this paint around and create a little bit of texture in the rooftop. So this is just a plastic scraping tool. You can use a credit card, the edge of a credit card. I want to change the angle on this part of the roof. Now I'm going to take a dark middle value here, and I'm using a mixture of royal blue with quinacridone and burnt orange. Those two make some nice neutrals and neutral grays when mixed together. So I'm going to start to paint in some of these darker valued areas here. This is the window, or one of the where a window is at, where it's cut out in the brick, and it just looks back into a dark area inside this abandoned building. And I don't like to go too dark too fast, but I'll be going darker in this area. Got the window, and now I'm going to do the open doorway. This is another area that'll be much darker, well, when I finish the painting. But as I do this, I build it up with light values, middle values, and dark values, and I might paint some interesting shapes within these shapes themselves. Here I'm going to introduce some quinacridone and burnt orange, and I'm going to scrape this a little bit to indicate that there's some grass, some weeds growing here at the base of this building, kind of covering the door, and it's been sitting here empty for a while. I want to carry the indication of that grass growing at the base of this building farther over, so I just keep working with the quinacridone, burnt orange, and royal blue mixtures. The cooler mixture has a little bit more royal blue, and the warmer mixture has a little bit more quinacridone and burnt orange. Now I'm just going to use my scraping tool. You can see I don't just use a tip. There's times where I use the broad edge, and it creates an interesting array of grassy shapes coming up. I want to give the indication that here in the foreground we have some weeds and some grass that's growing. This whole parking lot for this abandoned gas station is kind of overgrown with busted up gravel or concrete and grass growing through the cracks, and I'm going to give a slight indication of that here, and again I'll make this a little bit more towards the middle value later on. I'm going to take a 1-inch flat brush, and I'm just going to use the side and the tip to create a little bit of texture here and just indicate some of the irregularity and the texture that's in this ground, the gravel laying around. So it's just creating a broken edge as I make that there's brush strokes to the side of the brush. Now I'm just scraping them up a little bit to make them look like there's some grass there. Here I have another dark window that I'm going to paint. I like to try and keep a clean edge when painting something like this, because the windows are going to be you're looking back into a dark building, so it's going to be a very dark hard edge against a bright white front of the building. And if the edge isn't clean, you'll notice it in the painting, and especially if it's wavy. So I'm putting in this rather dark middle value, and later on when I come back in to go darker with this, which I'll do, I'll probably use some drafting tape or some rice tape to give myself some cleaner edges. Here I have another window on the side of the building that's again looking into the empty building. It's dark inside. Now that one in the front, to the left of this one, you can see a little square out of it because you actually can look through this window and out the back and see some blue sky there and trees. So I'll paint those in. So now I'm going to take some cerulean blue so that it looks like we're seeing through this building and seeing sky. And then I'm going to take some sap green and I'm going to give an indication here that there's some trees there. Now I'm going to paint the blue stripes that wrap around this building. And I want these to be clean lines. They're nice straight lines. So I'm going to use some drafting tape here. Drafting tape doesn't have as aggressive an adhesive as masking tape. And it does a pretty good job of sealing the edges when you want nice clean edges. So I'm masking this thin line first. And I'm going to paint this with a manganese blue. So I've got the drafting tape on that line, on the edge of the line that's going on the front of the building. And this is a thin stripe. There's a thin and a thick stripe. The thick stripe actually has some letters in it. But I'm just going to go ahead and paint that. And I try and vary it a little bit as I'm putting it down. I put a little bit more water there just so it's faded. So it's not like a racing stripe that was just painted solid, just a little bit of variation in the application. Now I'll take that tape off, and then you can see that I have a nice clean edge on that line. I've taped the larger stripe, and now I'm going to paint that, and there's some letters here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll, as I paint within this taped area, I'm going to be painting some letters. Now as I fill in around these letters, as I paint this stripe, I'm going to break up the edges a little bit because the lettering, the paint's kind of worn in areas, so I'm just going to blot that with a tissue. And the edges on the edge of the stripe are pretty clean, but some of that lettering, it actually says Food Center, the letter is kind of faded in some areas and broken up, so I don't want to just outline everything with a halo of blue paint. I'm going to break it up a little bit and lose some of those edges. I'm going to get a little stronger with the mixture I'm putting down here. Vary that some. And I'll take some of that in a few other areas here. It's still wet. I'm going to let that just kind of gradate into some of those areas. Now this stripe continues, but this part of the that I'm going to paint now is recessed from the other area where the stripe was, so it's offset a little bit so those edges don't quite line up because there's a corner to the brick between these two areas of stripe. So I'm just going to paint that in solid. This stripe wraps around the building, so I've masked off the edges on this stripe on the side of the building. So that's going to continue back. I've dried it, removed the tape from the large stripe, and now I'm masking off the narrow stripe that wraps around also. And I do want to mention that when you're masking like this, you want to make sure you dry it before you pull up the tape, because if it's wet, you're going to get it all over it's going to run past the edge, and it's going to make marks where you don't want it. You're going to get paint where you don't want it. So I've got that narrow stripe, and now the stripe is at the bottom, but there's very little of the stripe left down here towards the bottom. So I'm just going to give some indication of that blue stripe that used to be there. There's a few more areas here where there's a little bit of this blue. There's a block up there that's painted blue, and now that narrow blue stripe carries across there. Put that reference photo in the top right corner for a moment so you can see how this is developing. You can see those blue stripes that wrap around the building, but you can see how there's some block. It's like a warm gray block that's right underneath the windows, and so I'm going to put that wash on there, and I'm leaving some broken edges as I make a brush stroke here to leave some texture. But that window, you can see, needs to be much darker in all those windows where you're looking into that empty building. It's a much darker value, so that's something that I'm going to do is deepen the value inside that building. There's some blocks here along the edge of this doorway that are different colors, so I'm going to just paint those in. I'm going to put some darker values on the underside of this awning and make a few linear marks here, just to put that a little bit more in shadow. And I'm going to fill that area in. This is a mixture of quinacridone burnt orange and royal blue. I use that a lot in this painting. There's some windows, or a window in the top of the side here. It's pretty much just dark. I'm going to give an indication that we're seeing through those windows, and put a little bit of calligraphy here around the molding that surrounds this window, just to indicate that there's some words there. I want to define these edges a little bit more, so just taking some of this mixture and just making some calligraphy marks, some linear marks here. I use this quill brush a lot for these types of marks when I'm doing this type of brush work. So I just give, I don't normally make one continuous line. I make sure it's broken up. It's a lot more interesting that way. So I'll make short dashes and dots as I move along. I'm going to indicate that there's a board here going across. And now the boards that are make the framing of the roof on this otherwise kind of a cinder block building is painted white, but it's very weathered. So now I'm going to just try and give it a bit of a weathered look on the panels. So I have this quill brush, but I'm dragging it on the side, and it's giving me a broken edge as I do that. And this is the mixture of quinacridone burnt orange and royal blue. It's thinned down a little bit, but I'm going to get a little darker in some spots with it. And I don't want to overdo it. I want to give an indication that this is kind of weathered, but I don't want to just sit down here and try and render every board. And I don't want this to carry the same level of this activity all the way up. I'm just going to break it up a little bit and vary the amount of it, and then the viewer can figure it out that that's just a rough boards on this building, and there's an assumption that there's probably more, but it's just enough of an indication for the viewer to understand what's going on there. And like I said, I use that royal blue and the quinacridone burnt orange quite a bit. I can swing that mixture either warm or cool and get it fairly neutral. Now I'm going to take a light wash. I'm going to glaze over this this foreground area, this drive, or the parking lot that was for this gas station. Just going to glaze over this a little bit to tone down the white of the paper. And we'll see how this goes. I may need to come back and get a little darker with that. And then there's some gravel that's been piled there to the right side of the building. So I'm going to glaze over that. I've added a little bit more of a red tone to that. So that's a little bit of rose madder quinacridone. As I said, I'm going to come back in and paint this area darker. And I want to keep that clean edge that I talked about. So I have put some drafting tape around the outer edges of this. Not where I'm painting right now, but the outer edges here. I've put some drafting tape so that I can maintain some clean edges when I put this dark value in. It just doesn't look very good if you have an irregular edge that you're trying to paint freehand. Some people can paint a very clean edge. I can do okay, but I like to make sure that it's going to be nice, razor sharp edge on this type of an application, because I have this very dark value that's going to be going right against this bright white, and you'll see if your line's just crooked and irregular and wavy. I've taped this side window. Now I'm going to paint it with a much darker value. So I've removed the tape, and I've taped this door and the window to the left. If you look at that window I just painted, hopefully you can see where there's some both warm and cool tones in there. I have some area, they're dark value, but there's some blue and there's some of that quinacridone burnt orange. I'm going to scrape into this a little bit just to help highlight that grass that's coming out of the ground there. And now I'm going to paint this other window, and the wash I'm using is pretty cool. There's a little bit more blue in it. And it makes that inside of this building feel kind of dark and abandoned. And then you can look through, one area you can see that blue sky where you can see all the way through that building. But these are very dark values now. And I'm going to put a little bit of that up in this window that's up in the peak here on the right side of the gas station. I'm going to do a little brush work with that dark value just to carry that value through the composition a little bit. There's a light fixture hanging off on either corner here. Just use that value to highlight a few edges. Just helps balance the composition. A few of these areas should have a little bit of a stronger shadow. So I'm taking a mixture here with royal blue with just a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange in it, glazing over this area here. That awning from where the gas pumps would be is casting a shadow onto this building and onto the ground. And I'm going to take a little bit of this glaze, and I'm going to put a few touches of it around the building where some boards are overhanging and it might cast some shadows. So I'm going to go to the right side of the building here, and there's an edge. So I'm going to just indicate that. And again, I'm using my quill brush. It's quite versatile. A lot of times I use the edge of the point rather than the point. There are times when I use the point for sure, but I can get a lot of different marks by putting that brush at different angles. Here, just some indication of an edge. Next, I want to take this foreground to more of a middle value. It's too much like the building, and that's a little bit yellow probably, but that has some raw sienna there and some quinacridone burnt orange. I'm going to tone that down with a little bit of cerulean blue. I want this foreground to be more of a middle value so that it feels separate spatially from that building. That building's got the darkest values, and in the distance it's very light. There's not much detail. So I'm going to put this middle value more dominant here in the immediate foreground. I'm going to use my scraping tool here and just scrape some textures into this area. So I want to give a little bit more paint here. And there I want to just suggest some grass growing up. Those are shorter marks that I'm making than what I'm making right here. These are longer kind of directional marks that I'm making to help lead you into the composition. I'm going to put a few more darker values at the base of the walls here and continue to suggest that there's some grass, some weeds growing at the base of this. And then scrape a little bit. And that's it. This is a fairly simple composition. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it. And there's my painting, Fillerup. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about my videos or my online courses, you can click on one of the boxes appearing on the screen.